afternoon, good morning, good evening. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this European Aviation Conference Institute and GARS webinar. This is our monthly webinar. This is the sixth, given that it's June, the sixth webinar in our series as we lead up to the European Aviation Conference itself in Antwerp at the end of November. We have been discussing, as I'm sure you will remember, an array of topics, and we are back today to talk about, yet again makes it sound like we shouldn't be or something. That's completely the wrong thing to do. We are back today. I'm delighted to say we are talking today about the European approach to how we incentivize people to move away from fossil fuels and towards SAFs. Now, those of you who have been watching regularly will know that I have taken the liberty, the extreme liberty of being, in my usual flippant way, trying to boil it down to, or simplify it down to simply the US situation where carrots have been applied through what's called the unfortunately named IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, and where the general perception, at least here in Europe, is that huge amounts of money will be thrown at the airlines, as opposed to the European approach, which has been very much more mandate driven. And again, in my flippant oversimplification way, I took the liberty of calling that sticks. So we then got into, and we've now had 2 or 3 of these meetings where we've discussed carrots versus sticks. I'd like to hope that we're starting our very own economic theory of carrotism. It's good to have a hobby, I think, but it's about time we balance the ledger. But having balanced it by having 2 European speakers today, and we'll talk about the European process, and we'll talk about what's going on in Europe. But even within that, I'm delighted to say we have Mr. Damien Meadows from DG Klima, and Damien has done yeoman's work trying to push back on the concept that there is no money available on the European side of the ocean. And Mr. Laurent Dussel, who is the Deputy Chief Executive, or DG, or whatever the correct title is, at Airlines for Europe, which is Europe's largest airline trade association. And Laurent, in fact, was the absolute policy point person on all matters to do with sustainability, decarbonisation, and of course the entire discussion surrounding the whole sticks. There's a better word? Mandates, the whole greening and EU fuel directive and so forth. So I've managed to mangle that fairly comprehensively, and I apologise for that. But Laurent, perhaps I can start with you. In about March of this year, I was at the A4E, the Airlines for Europe annual CEO summit, and frankly, it was a parade of the complainers. It was just this non-stop whinge fest from the CEOs of your members complaining that their American colleagues were getting showered with money and they were being forced to behave. Is that a fair summary of what they were saying?
I think, so thanks, Andrew, and thanks for having me on the podcast. It's a very interesting time to be discussing this because, as you know, we're just about to move to a new political cycle where we'll be less focused on setting targets for biofuels or for carbon price, but more making sure that we'll be implementing them and reaching our targets, and what do we need to do to implement them. And I think first to your questions about the concerns, I think they are real. If you look at where SAF is being uplifted for the moment, clearly the United States is the best place at the moment to uplift fuels, and where the subsidies also are the most interesting. I think it's when you look at the American carriers, who are leading with half of the top 10 airlines committed to future SAF usage, being US based. I think it's a clear sign that the change on the airline side is really propelled by the IRA. Now, and so there is clearly a concern in the short term. Now, I think where to go back to your metaphor about the carrot and the stick, I think when you look in the medium and long term, the picture starts to be much more nuanced, and it's not so much of a carrot and stick approach, but actually we find ourselves, and when we speak to investors looking in the long term, quite comfortable that because carbon pricing is there to stay in Europe, because the mandate is there to stay, we know exactly year after year how much SAF will have to be delivered at EU airport until 2050. that actually in the long term, Europe is probably the best place to produce and to use sustainable aviation fuel. But where we clearly have an issue now is for the next 2 or 3 years, because when you look at where the SAF is coming from on the US side, it's mostly where investment decisions have already been taken for projects that are already ongoing. So the nervousness is really between now and say 2026, not so much for 2030, 2035, 2050, and so on.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. When you say, if you look at where the SAF is coming from, within the United States, where is it coming from? Is it being manufactured by the big oil companies? Is it being manufactured by the airlines?
I think, unfortunately, the big energy majors have disregarded the needs for the aviation sector to have these more sustainable fuels. Certainly the case for the HEFA fuels, the biogenic fuels, as we call them, even more so for the fancy, much more expensive electrofuels. So where SAF is coming from, it's not coming from the energy majors. It's mostly SMEs who are themselves selling on to the large energy majors who supply at airports. In the United States and in Europe, I think the most of the production comes from small firms. I think Neste, for example, in the US, but also in Europe, clearly has big credit in commercializing and developing a supply chain for the SAF. But we're still waiting to see when the large oil majors and energy majors will jump on the aviation SAF ship.
So just to be clear, and they are, so what you're speaking about in the short term of biofuels, which is to say made from ethanol or wood chips or used cooking oil and so forth, and they are significantly cheaper than e-fuels, which is the powder liquid proposal. But my understanding, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that the biofuel, the feed mass that you need for biofuels is somewhat limited indeed. You know, we're almost topping out on it now. So the future is definitely e-fuels. Is that what you're saying?
I think there's a general consensus in Europe, also building on the experience of the ramp up of biofuels and biodiesels in road transport that happened in the late 90s, that we need to be very careful as to how far we want to go with the biofuels, because of pressure on land use, because of sustainability concerns. So the way the mandate has been built at the European level is HEFA will be the main solution between now and 2030. And by the way, we're comfortable that we will meet these mandates. But in the long run, the moment you start reaching 30, 60, 70 blending percentages, then you need to start thinking about the most advanced biofuels. And clearly here the path is these electrofuels. So between now and 2030, HEFA, 2035, 2040, advanced biofuels, but in the long term, we need to start looking at the power to liquid as the RFNBO, the renewable fuels of non-biological origin, as we like to call them in Europe. And that needs to be where we need to see a more investment and more deployment. But in the short term, between now and 2030, I mean, there was recent report by ICF, also a Dutch SAF producer called Sky Energy, that said the mandate in 2030, we're quite comfortable with that. There will be feedstock, the production will be there. Question is, at what cost is it going to come? And this is where airlines start to get a bit nervous.
So Damien, turning to you, at what cost is needing to, I mean, what Laurence just said is you know, short term, we've got a bridging solution, if you like, but any serious longer term solution is going to take some serious financing. Or is going to, well, what is it going to take? Is it financing? Is it certainty? What does Klima think we need to get beyond, you know, and I'm not trying to downplay it, but the short-term fix, if you like, of biofuel?
Sure, no, thanks, Andrew. And I think there's three things here. I mean, one of them, which I think was the leitmotif from Ursula von der Leyen when she became president, is a long-term price signal and commercial viability. So when the big oil majors are not getting involved in this, I mean, you see them relentlessly focused on profit. And unless you make it profitable, then you are, in a sense, pushing water uphill. So the long-term price signal, I think, of Europe, which is 200 euros a ton for e-fuels and biofuels, it's technologically neutral. This is essential. But short-term, and I mean, this is where I think it's been underappreciated, is that Europe has a version of what in the US is known as ARPA-E, the initiative to really have breakthrough technologies. So we're spending 1.6 billion euros on around 30 biofuel and e-fuel projects up in Norway, up in Stockholm. We also have hydrogen subsidies of 700 million euros in the Iberian Peninsula, largely to get hydrogen, which could then go into e-fuels. So there's an awful lot going on upstream from the aviation industry, which understandably isn't necessarily seen by the CEOs, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The third element of this is, I would say, inspired by what I saw in US carbon pricing bills 15, 20 years ago. It's this 1.6 billion euro fund, first come, first served, for the deployment of biofuels in Europe and e-fuels in Europe today. So any airline using e-fuels or biofuels today in Europe can get up to 100% of the cost difference paid for. And that's where, obviously, I assume some airlines are trying to maximize their benefits from this, but it really is an exceptionally generous support level, also targeted to regional and outlying airports because of social concerns. So there's a very big fund. And yeah, I mean, I hear concerns that this fund might be exhausted, but when I look at historical biofuel levels use, e-fuel levels, frankly, 1.6 billion euros to cover the cost difference is a pretty large sum.
It sounds like a reasonable number from here, that's for sure. But so is there a queue of airline CEOs outside your door with their hands out?
Well, I mean, I think complaining is something that as a civil servant you always expect to hear. And
airline CEOs are bred to do, let me assure you.
Your words. I mean,
I've burnt my bridges.
The Innovation Fund is now open to reducing any of aviation's climate effects. So the non-CO2 impacts, which are real, there's money being offered to reduce these impacts.
But I come back to it. Are the airlines already queuing up to get this money?
Well, I mean, the complaint here is it's complicated. So bids are put in. The current 4 billion euro offered. I don't know whether any of the non-CO2 or electrification bids are successful. We'll know in a few months. But the 1.6 billion euros is a super simple mechanism. Simply, you use the fuel and then you ask for the money covering the cost difference. So we will only know in 2025 what airlines used in 2024. But it's been written in law that was agreed at the end of 2022. Airlines have a legal right to claim this money. It's really designed to maximize the speed of deployment. I mean, I've heard some complaints there that it should guarantee sort of support to particular refineries for a decade. That's interesting. We'll have a review in 2026. But the way it was set up was basically come forward, do this, and you get support. So we'll see in 2025 what's happened, but it would be kind of crazy of airlines not to take benefit of this because it is up to 100% support from the European system.
So two questions arising from that, and I apologise for my ignorance, but if an airline, I don't know, let's pluck the name of an airline out of nowhere, you know, if Lufthansa actually worked out how to get to Brussels and to your door and had spent a huge amount of money, one single airline could in fact take 100%. I realise it's unlikely, but one single airline could take 100% of that 1.6 bill.
Well, I mean, the big airlines, I would say, are aware of this. I think Laurent has also helped with making awareness also for the smaller airlines. But this fund didn't come out of nowhere. There were airlines and others that lobbied for it. So I think there is awareness. One of the limitations is it's only for the percentage of flights covered by effective carbon pricing. So that means for regional airlines flying, you know, with the Canary Islands, with the Azores, potentially all of their fuels can be supported from this. But neither the Parliament or the Council was willing to accept IATA's contention that transatlantic flights should get this support at 100% without any effective carbon pricing through the ETS. So that also means the amount will go further because Lufthansa's traffic, a lot of it is extra European. I mean, the legislator didn't say that this support was for those flights.
Right. So, Laurent, you've been helping your members understand this fund exists. What is this all post-March, or was what the CEOs were saying at the summit performative?
I think so. Two things on also to react to what Damien just mentioned. Now, I think you have to appreciate the the simplicity of the tool, because in a sense, the subsidy on the user side will be weaved into the airline's own annual ETS compliance. You won't have to surrender allowances for the amount of CO2 that you have emitted by burning SAF. And so it kind of decouples what the carbon pricing already does now in terms of incentivizing business decision making to go to the SAF. Where I think it's a little bit tricky also in the mindset of most of the fuel producers is that this is a subsidy that comes on the consumer's end, so on the airline side, and not on the production side. From a SAF production or oil energy major mentality, where most of the support has usually been for production, for R&D, and so on. In a sense, you will say it's only an Excel sheet that that, like, when Neste speaks to Ryanair, they will know that the amount of fuel that they will sell to Ryanair, part of the price will be covered through Ryanair's ETS compliance. So it's a little bit a change of mindset, and I don't think we're quite there yet. And so there's a really big exercise of making sure that, yes, you have 20 million allowances, which basically represents the amount of CO2 that you will have saved by complying with the EU mandate between now and 2030, roughly. But that funding is not really yet in the front of mind of most of the fuel suppliers. So they haven't really integrated this in their commercial pitch, basically, and in their discussions of the offtake agreements.
Can I just come back? Thank you. I'll come back to that second point in a moment, but can I come back to the first point, and both for you, Laurent, and perhaps you, Damien, just to be sure that I'm clear. The 1.6 billion is actually cash money. I mean, you could take it to the bank. That's a question. So then what? But am I also right? That didn't sound like that. So am I also right, though, that another feature of this is if you burn SAF, you aren't required to hand in emission trading certificates. So you are saving the money you would otherwise have to spend to acquire the certificates. Is that right?
Yes. So on the second, you're absolutely right that the ETS offers this price incentive. You simply don't have to pay a carbon cost if you're using sustainable fuels or e-fuels. So that's the €200 per ton of fuel incentive that analysts, they expect the carbon price to increase over time. So that incentive, as Laurent said, this is a long-term incentive. It's expected to grow. On the allowances,
but from an airline accountant's perspective, and there are a few people on earth I worry about less than them, but from an airline accountant's perspective, this is a saving, isn't it? Yeah. This is money they don't have to spend. I guess it's not quite a saving. But,
it's a saving, but it's by no means covered the cost difference for the alternative fuels.
No, I accept that. But it's one thing they don't have to purchase to produce a flight. But if they do purchase SAF, furthermore, they can come around with their cap in their hand and ask for some of that 1.6 bill. Have I got that right?
Absolutely, and the 1.6 billion goes further because some of the cost is paid for from not having a carbon price. So,
right. Okay.
The Commission has the job of calculating all this per fuel type. That's also maybe one reason for the hesitation is we haven't published the prices of the SAF and e-fuels for 2024 yet. We will do that in early 2025 once the year is over. So
stupidly, I thought people like to know the price of stuff before they bought it.
Well, this is not an obligation to take this money. You said cap in hand. I wouldn't say that. I think it's a rational choice to ask for this support. But it's rather similar to sort of the ETS free allocations that have been given out for the last decade. You receive allowances. I think all 500 airlines under the ETS are familiar with allowances. You can hold on to these or they're worth money. And you would receive a number of allowances corresponding to a headline price per fuel. So if e-fuels are €4,000 more expensive, you would receive the allowances corresponding to €4,000 for every ton of e-fuel that you used.
Right, and sorry, then just to pick up though on that point and to pick back up to something that Laurent said, this is money that goes directly to the airlines.
Yeah.
Not to the fuel producers, not to the either big oil or small oil or whatever. This goes to the airlines themselves.
Yeah, this was considered a sensible design choice because the airlines still have an incentive to negotiate down the prices of e-fuel and biofuels, and then it covers the average costs of the fuel. But DG Clima has always worked in an economic system, knowing that market participants agree among themselves in the most favourable way. So the airlines still have an incentive to buy cheaper biofuels. If you'd given it out at the supply side, which is, at the production side, which is what we're doing with other parts of the ETS's innovation fund, you don't necessarily bring through a lower price to the airlines themselves. But maybe Laurent wants to come in on this.
I would obviously never say that oil companies have been known to behave in a slightly less than wholly ethical way. Laurent, isn't that a difference though between the IRA and the European decision that the money is flowing to the airlines, not to the manufacturers?
But yes, but that was the purpose. This is also something that we liked in the idea of these SAF allowances, is that there's a intra-aviation distributional element in there. Who is paying the carbon price? It's the airline. So if there's money taken from the revenues from that carbon pricing, what should it go for the fuel supplier? You know, make it.
Well, indeed. Why should it go to the fuel supplier? Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's the key question. Make it an incentive where not only you don't have to surrender allowances when you burn SAF, but also you receive allowances in return, pro rata to the type of SAF that you have used. Right. I think this is where also, you know, back to your metaphor about the carrot and the stick. This is also where we like the SAF allowances, because it's not only even for the SAF that will be mandated, that will be in any case in airports, but there's also incentive to airlines to go beyond that. And you will have heard many airlines saying, oh, I want to do 10% 2030, I want to do 12%, and even more so when you look at the cargo. So there's really an aspect to that. Now it's really key to make sure that this is being used. I mean, the last thing that could happen to the scheme is that basically, you know, this doesn't trigger the right business decision making to say, okay, I'm going to uplift this SAF because I know that down the line it's as much in terms of allowances that I don't have to surrender. And you know, and there's a clear concern there about how do we reduce the price of the CO2 compliance. So this is really the key, where you try to bridge gap between one, a mandate on SAF, but that doesn't do anything on prices, and on the other side, a carbon pricing, but that doesn't really have anything specific to the SAF beyond the zero rating.
Damien, does that make sense to you? Are you with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is where we were talking about big companies, small companies. I mean, small companies do tend to be the innovators in the literature. And I mean, for those companies who want to go to very high levels, they can get very high levels of support on this. So it really is an approach which should trigger a rush to use these fuels, because, yeah, I mean, it's there now, it's up to 100%. And what I hear more often is people saying 1.6 billion euros isn't enough, it's going to run out. Here are responses: we would like to see it used up. Parliament voted for it to be twice the size. And I mean, things that are popular are far easier to continue than things that are unpopular. So we have a review of the ETS in 2026. And if we see airlines are busy using this up and doing things we want to see happen, I really think the European Parliament and the member states would be persuaded to expand this.
So is it 1.6 per annum or 1.6 between now and 2026?
So 1.6 billion is the price assumption for the 20 million allowances, and it's available from 2024 until it runs out. But because we have a revision of the ETS taking place by 2027, I mean, frankly, if it was used up in the next 3 years, the legislator can top it up to the levels the European Parliament wanted or above in 2027. So I mean, I think it's going to be, two things are going to be really interesting. The first is to see how fast airlines are moving in Europe to use SAF. The other element is going to be the fact that the Commission has to publish the average prices. We're working with member states, stakeholders to do this. But I think that transparency is going to be really, really important, to say, this is how much extra HEFA costs. This is how much extra advanced biofuels and e-fuels cost. And it was designed that we update that price every year, because obviously these prices should be coming down over time. But that transparency, I think, is a kind of global service being given, because it's, I understand, really, really hard to know how much these fuels are trading for at the moment.
Yeah. Laurent very graciously described my carrot and stick description as a metaphor, and I'm grateful for that. I feel much better for knowing I was using a metaphor. But can I focus on that for just a moment? The big issue that I keep hearing is that people won't invest in making SAF if there's no regulatory certainty. And the mandates were an attempt, I believe, tell me if I'm wrong, Damien, the mandates, say what you like about the mandates, they provide regulatory certainty, right? Is that not right? So, Laurent, are your members saying that somehow or other, even though there are mandates, we don't have certainty, or what do they want? Stricter mandates, bigger mandates? What is it that the members want? Your members?
I think the mandate is good for the moment. We're happy with the way it is. We're not asking to review the targets. We're comfortable that the targets will be reached. I think there's a question as to how far do we go beyond the targets. Very interesting to keep an eye on what will happen in the next few years. Are we going to see a fragmentation of the market between the mandated SAF and the voluntary SAF, which probably we may have different sustainability definition, by the way.
What do you mean by that? Sorry. If the mandate is I've got to have 2% SAF and I get to 2.5, that's just me getting to 2.5.
Well, you may see, for example, DHL has already doing more now than what requires the mandate. And there will be imports of SAF, and some of the imports, for example, including from the US, may be of different nature than what is defined as SAF under RefuelEU, for example. Take the discussion over food and feeds production and feed the ethanol. Eligible under the RED and therefore for the ETS, but not eligible under RefuelEU. So that's something that we need to clarify. I don't want to take you down the rabbit hole of the feedstock discussion, but yes, it's certainly something that keeps me awake at night. What I meant to say is that what we like with the mandate and why we want the mandate to stay the way it is because we know exactly. Say we are consuming now for this year possibly 43 million tons of fuels at EU airports. Take a conservative 10% between now and 2030. So by 2030, we'll have 37, 38 million tons of fuels. That means that we know exactly that out of that, 2.7 million tons will have to be SAF, and including 0.3 million tons for the RFNBO. This is a great certainty for the fuel supplier. And you may ask even the question to be a bit more provocative as the tax incentive that you see in the United States, independently from the future political landscape in the United States. But you may ask, well, how popular and how defendable is it going to be from a public perception point of view the moment you have tax incentive when you reach mandates that are 15, 20, 25%, because this is as much in terms of tax revenues that the airlines won't pay into state budget in the US. So maybe are these fiscal incentive going there to stay in the long term, the same way carbon pricing and mandates are there to stay in the long term?
So sorry, just to be sure I understand that. There are tax incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, which almost sounds counterintuitive, but those tax incentives only kick in at a certain point. Is that right?
So the SAF blenders tax credit only applies for 23-24. And then you have the clean fuel production tax credit, which basically kicks in 2025, but it's meant to last only until 2027. So it sends a really good signal that the US government wants to incentivize the sectors, investors want to see a profitable case. But there is a question as to say, well, how long is this to stay in the long term? History has proven that, once you have these tax credit and the subsidies in place, the industry gets addicted and, you have vested interest. So maybe it would stay, but you could say maybe it would be more questioned publicly in terms of social acceptance than the carbon pricing. And that this is purely for the SAF. I think the hydrogen question is very different. And there, I think EU has a lot of work to do on hydrogen, because clearly from the hydrogen side, the US is the best place and continues to be the best place for a couple of years until there's major change at the EU level.
Right, and by a lot of work, you mean a lot of catching up. Yeah, a lot of catching up to. We'll come to hydrogen in just a minute, but Damien, I just wanted to. Did you go back and ask when you were looking at the scheme you've put in place? Did you study what was going on in the United States and take a sort of a deliberate view to move in a slightly different way?
Yeah, I mean, for 20 years, we've always looked at what's happening in the US. That's the best way to regulate is innovating and improving over time, seeing what others are doing. So we've looked at the US examples. I mean, the particular one I'm familiar with here was where the McCain-Lieberman bill wanted to support the first CCS plants enormously and then have it digressive over time, basically to reward first movers. And I was in discussions with e-fuel companies this week, and it was all about rewarding first movers and ensuring that they don't lose out. So this idea actually came from the Transport Committee in Parliament. I think one reason I think it can be extended is I've never before seen something like this flow so swiftly from the Transport Committee into the Parliament plenary position and the position of the 27 member states. So if it's even moderately successful, I think it's going to be extended. But it was modeled on US approaches we've seen before, just like the Innovation Fund is similar to ARPA-E in terms of spending money upstream on production. I think Europe's basically, in a world where we have the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, we're into a world of big carrots, far fewer sticks. And we've got multiple ways here to support biofuels and e-fuels, because frankly, the industry targets in the past have been woefully missed. I remember IATA saying there'd be 10% biofuel by 2017. We didn't
I
quite
think it was
manage
much more optimistic than that.
Well, I mean, frankly, now with this incentive, it really should happen, because also it's very hard to have a cartel-like approach not to do it. I mean, any company that does use biofuels and e-fuels can get this support.
So this is sort of a battle of the cartels, though, isn't it? You imperfectly, because of the difference between the US and the EU situation, but you're trying to create a cartel of purchasers. I think that's called a monopoly, to fight against the cartel of producers who are refusing to move. It's sort of a clash of the titans, isn't it?
I wouldn't say a cartel. I mean, this is still strictly.
I'm using the word very loosely, and no one's paying any attention. You can say whatever you like here.
So I mean, FedEx, United, when they fly within Europe, I mean, any airline in the world is able to benefit from this. And if they don't,
no, sorry, don't get hung up on my words. I was trying to be, I was trying to be facetious. I think I was successful. My point more is that historically we have been, as an industry, at the whim and at the mercy of the big oil companies, right? And there doesn't seem to be anything we can do to ever shift those bastards, right? Technical term there. So maybe there's a lot to be said, and a lot to be, much to be said in favour of empowering the purchasers for once, because normally we are just at the liberty of whatever it is that happens at the end of the production line for fuel. Do you agree with that, David?
I would agree with you, but I would emphasize Laurent's point here that, I mean, IATA encourages subsidies of whatever type, and I mean, subsidizing the airlines should get it moving fast. But in the US, I mean, I think there are political stability concerns, duration concerns, if it's coming from the taxpayer. Here, at least, aviation is contributing in the overall carbon pricing system. So I think that makes it more durable. But
there are more ways to make subsidies than just the one. Yeah.
I mean, I think other sectors are looking jealously at this as well. I mean, the maritime sector, who are covered by carbon pricing, the railway sector, because this is aviation-specific support. And frankly, I mean, I think this works politically, because it hopefully brings the changes we need to see in terms of real use of SAF. But I think other sectors do look at this and sort of, they say they would want the same thing.
Right, Laura, is that your feeling as well, that this is quite a good model, that other sectors like it, and more importantly, that perhaps it's a way to take the fight back to big oil?
I mean, it's the best thing that I've seen from the European Parliament in many years. What can I say? It was a very good.
Come on, there's the single European sky.
Well, what's the what? I mean, we really like the approach. To your point about the subsidies, I think inevitably the moment you start calling for subsidies comes the question of where the money is going to come from.
Yeah. And
certainly from the aviation sector, we don't want to push for more taxes. But there's one thing, and which, by the way, applies across the EU, like many taxes, whether we like it or not, and that's the carbon price. And I think there's been a real disconnect the moment aviation has been covered by the ETS, if I'm not mistaken. Damien would know better than me, in 2012, and the moment you start creating a carbon price, and the moment you start putting on the market that alternative technology to which you can use to reduce your carbon price. If I'm not mistaken, I remember when in 2012, aviation, the ETS was expanded to aviation. The Commission had this communication which said in 2022 we will want to produce 1 million tons of SAF in Europe. Well, that didn't really go so well.
Yeah, how's that
Why? Because most of the energy measure, every time they were producing biofuels, were setting it where the profit margin were the highest, and that's in the road transport. And this is why 5 years ago, I remember we started knocking on the door of the Commission saying, well, market failure, let's look at the French approach when that happens, is that we need a planned economy, and this is what a mandate is. And actually, so it would be a lie to say that we supported the mandate in the first place, but if this is the only way for us to incentivize producers to bring the SAF to the airport, then so be it.
So can I just change the focus just a little bit? This is a topic that's, please excuse this pun, burning up a lot of energy in Europe and within European airlines, and the IRA, I think, has got the attention to some extent of the American carriers. But if you go to Asia, if you go to other parts of the world, no one seems to care at all about this. And indeed, Willie Walsh, the DG of IATA at the AGM a couple of weeks ago, said effectively that this sustainability, this is a European problem, and we don't talk to the rest of the world about this stuff. How do we encourage the other regions of the world, the Indias, the Russias, the Asias, the Africans, to come on board as well? That's a question. Both of you, but I'll start with you, Laurent, because you're on my screen.
I mean, it's a philosophical question. Very practically and pragmatically from an aviation perspective, if this is only a European project where the EU steams ahead with a sort of green agenda without trying to bring the rest of the world on board, then we have an issue. I mean, and I'll let Damien talk about the state of climate. I'm here sitting in Brussels at 27 degrees and it's horrible. But it also reads distortion of competition and carbon leakage. Passengers flying to Istanbul instead of flying to Athens to avoid paying the carbon price that we have in Europe, or passengers deciding to limit their flight from Frankfurt to Phuket, and instead of flying all the way to Phuket with SAF in the tanks, to shorten their flights to stop in the Middle East to limit the amount of SAF that they have to uplift and therefore the additional cost. This is not good for the business and it's not good for climate change. So yes, it needs to be, and this is really one of the efforts that we need to see more, a European climate diplomacy and European aviation climate diplomacy, bringing, creating carbon clubs, promoting SAF mandates across the world. I mean, this is a really needs to be front and center in the whole agenda that we are about to draft now in Brussels, which is about how do we decarbonize in a competitive way.
Are you confident though? I mean, I think that's the first time in my life I've ever heard the expression European aviation climate diplomacy. I think that's what you said. I'm not getting the feeling the airlines are out there pushing this particular thing. They, in fact, seem to be doing exactly the reverse of this, trying to stop the carbon border adjustment mechanism, trying to stop any sort of exporting of this around the world.
That's not true. I mean, we need to start discussing how we expand the carbon border adjustment mechanism to the aviation sector. It would have to be dedicated. It would have to be about the carbon and not only the sustainable aviation fuel. But this is really an important issue for us.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Keeping in mind that the alternative, which is, well, let's reopen the target, let's re-question our commitment on climate change, is going to be very short-term thinking, because we know that the fallback position is what we do, ticket taxes, short-haul bans, operational restrictions, and that's not what we want. So we need to push this agenda, including outside of Europe. That's really a strategic priority for us.
Well, I have to say, as an interested observer, I don't see a lot of evidence of that yet. It's got to be said. So obviously, I wish you all the power in the world. Damien, what's Klima's view about extending these sorts of measures outside of the North Atlantic?
I mean, I think I'd emphasize as well that, I mean, Laurent has a challenge here because his members have different positions. I mean, some airlines are very progressive, some not so. But generally, I mean, aviation, it's a tiny proportion of the overall ETS. And this is what I think the CEOs don't always see. I mean, Laurent is right that in-sector reductions have been slower from aviation, but because of renewables in Europe, because of the carbon price, we had a 24% reduction year on year in emissions last year from the power sector, an 8% reduction from industry. So Europe is moving in reductions. And I mean, I and colleagues have been working with China for over a decade now on the Chinese carbon pricing system, which is twice the size of the European one. And they've adopted a national law.
You mean the price is twice as high, or there's twice as many?
No, the system is twice as many tons. So the Chinese adopted a law this year, I think, with compliance penalties of around 90 euros a ton. And this is in the context of a developing country. So this is, there's been impressive work going on in China, the beautiful China strategy, in terms of they know climate change is a big problem for them. I think most of the world accepts that climate change is a pretty frightening prospect unless we reduce our emissions fast. And so the Chinese ETS is twice the size of the EU ETS. They're going to include aviation, they've said. We don't know what scope yet. And it's frankly in countries' self-interest as well to put a price on pollution here. So we work with Indonesia, with India, with Brazil. I mean, I've been in Moscow in past years. I'm not sure we can rely upon action happening there. But frankly, just so much more needs to be done. And that's where I think mechanisms like giving money back to pay the cost difference for SAF, we're seeing that come from Singapore. And I think it's helpful to get policies through because, yeah, any new policy often does induce its share of complaining.
Mm-hmm. I'm still sort of hung up a little bit on this, argument's the wrong word, this fact that we can't get the big male or oil majors to come along. So we're going to have to start our own sort of, rebel fuel producing chain, which sounds like an extraordinarily expensive thing to have to do. Is a better alternative, and I'm treading very carefully here because the audience is made up almost entirely of economists, but is the better thing to do to actually give the oil majors an absolute monopoly and say, look, you boys have got a complete monopoly, and you've got a monopoly on fossil fuel, but it's going to end in 2045. But you'll have a monopoly for the next 50 years on SAFs as well. Is there some sort of other way we can incentivize? Because it's great, and I'm hearing everything you're saying about incentivizing the airlines and all those other things, but we still, the elephant in the room really is the oil majors, isn't it? I mean, if we get SAFs to 20%, 80% won't be SAF. It's as easy as that. So are people also working at ways to try to attack the oil majors with a crowbar or something like that? Damien, you'd have thought, and then Dealer.
Okay, I mean, here, part of the Green Deal, which hasn't been adopted yet, is the Energy Taxation Directive. So, I mean, that would make fossil fuels more expensive. It would encourage the shift to SAF, but that hasn't been adopted. Other jurisdictions haven't moved far with this. I mean, they're also attacked, I think, by IATA every time they do move to price fossil fuels. But I think pricing of fossil fuels would shift the oil majors, but our philosophy over 20 years has been to work with the market. I mean, I don't think we're going to, I remember hearing Ken Livingstone in the UK say this. I mean, Stalinist 5-year plans don't work. You need to work with market forces, to quote Obama, to tilt the level playing field towards cleaner solutions. And that's what a carbon price of 70 euros does. Now, for me, the oil majors, if they make money, they will switch. Maybe some of them will have sort of, what's the word? They'll have some delays internally. I mean, the managers who weren't used to this, the skill sets they have. But there is a place for the oil majors if they shift to produce the cleaner fuels, of course.
Laurent, do you think the airlines would be keen to push the oil majors a bit?
Certainly. I mean, they need to up their game. And I think we've been way too kind with them the past few years. I mean, and in a sense, the mandate
85 years. Yeah.
I think the mandate, in a sense, will do that. I wish that we had seen the energy majors investing more in renewables, and I fear, unfortunately, that looking at the quite significant profit that is being made in the oil and gas and the fossil fuel industry, the actual trend, maybe for the next 2 or 3 years, is going to be going in a different direction. So again, we'll be very happy to have the mandate, because if your fuel supply at Schiphol, at Charles de Gaulle, or at Frankfurt doesn't meet the target, well, you can pay the penalty and your way out of the providing the fuel, but the next day you still have to bring the fuel, even if you've paid a penalty. So there's no way around it. So the issue with the mandate is that this is only the bottom, and many airlines would like to go beyond this. And this is where it becomes more, okay, well, how do we allow those who want to go faster and further to do so, even if the mandate may be actually this is the only thing that we're going to get in the end.
I'm wondering if you're at the same A4E summit as I was. Frankly, you're very supportive and proactive. That wasn't the message I was getting from your members CEOs, just by the way. Damien mentioned...
Yeah, you have to recognize that there's so much that has happened at the European level over the past few years. Talk about taxation, the mandate, the carbon price, the subsidies. There's still many discussions about how do we streamline financing, this one-stop shop for the funding. It's a real challenge coming from a sector that basically used to receive the fuel at the airport and not have to start wondering whether whale carcasses should or should not constitute a sustainable feedstock. So there's a really steep learning curve from the airline. Let's not forget that before the COVID crisis, carbon price was around 10 to 12, 15 euros per ton of CO2. I haven't checked this morning, but I think Damien would say, well, around 80. So this is becoming the third largest cost for a low-cost carrier. The Ryanair, for example, ETS compliance is going to eat 7 to 8% of their profit margin for this year.
Well, that leaves, thank you. That's a lovely segue into the Lufthansa action, but I'll come to that in just a minute. Before we do that, Damien mentioned that whenever they try to make any sort of step forward, they get yelled at by IATA. And this week, or was it last week now, we saw the same again with the MRV, is that correct? Monitoring, reporting, and whatever V stands for contrails, for non-CO2 emissions. And all we're talking about is actually monitoring and finding out about the contrails. But yet the airlines seems to have mounted an enormous international campaign to stop that from happening. And that would include your members, of course, or some of them anyway. What's the background to that? Damien, do you want to go first?
No, I mean, for me, this is still a huge opportunity for the airline industry to seize some low-hanging fruit and prove that it's really supportive in public advocacy of sustainability, because the non-CO2 climate impacts we've known about for a long time. I mean, there was the IPCC study on this a long time ago. And
it's noted out, but I don't think anyone actually can put a finger on precisely how much there is. Isn't that part of the problem? I mean, one of the arguments I keep hearing is that the science is a bit iffy. A lovely word. The science is a bit iffy.
I mean, this is where the Innovation Fund is offering money for any airline that can reduce these impacts. I mean, there is no carbon pricing being proposed for these impacts, which are far more uncertain in terms of magnitude than carbon dioxide. So what would be lovely would be to see IATA and others sort of recognizing, I guess, that this is an area where the airline industry can look good by supporting measuring the magnitude of this and taking actions to reduce it where it makes sense. So I can't comment on the actions of individual airlines. I would only say it's
I'm not asking you to, but what is it that the airlines collectively are opposed to?
I don't know if they've always said that publicly, so I won't answer that.
Laurent, do you know?
What I can say, I mean, we've always been in favor of the MRV. We think we need an MRV. A well-done MRV can be a very powerful tool to, close the remaining gaps that we have in the scientific knowledge that we have on the non-CO2.
And so, sorry, just to close the circle on that, the MRV, this is a process where we monitor, we record, and we validate various things so that we know a heck of a lot more, right? On this area where it's still a little bit hard to know exactly where the science is.
I will not comment on the scope because of the sensitivity around the scope. I'm sure you're very much aware of the various position, but on the fundamental relevance of an MRV, that is a no-brainer. That is something.
So why do the airlines oppose it?
The scope and the amount of flights and the possible distortion of competition is the main issue. I think this is quite illustrative of the sensitivity that we have now when we're seeing EU going, with its own measures, steaming ahead, as I mentioned earlier, with its own measures and the risk that it creates distortion of competition. I think it's very, very interesting about what this means when you take a step back about, well, what kind of friction you're creating when some legislation are being put in place and it's not echoing sufficiently at the global level.
That way madness lies, doesn't it? I mean, if we're not going to do anything because no one else is doing anything, then no one will do anything. I mean, how do we get through this logjam, Damien? Has Klima got thoughts on this?
I think I would anticipate in the next 5 to 10 days, we'll put out a text for public comment. So that's usual when adopting legislation, we take stakeholder comments. And yeah, there'll be a 4-week period to comment on what the Commission puts out on its website, either later this week or next week.
And I know you can't be specific, but in gross terms, this would be an MRV system for flights to and from Europe. Is that to within and from Europe? Is that the deal?
I mean, we've had a stakeholder group. We've worked with airlines. I mean, this has been quite a transparent process. But again, I don't think I can be drawn just because I can double check the website. But it's not there as we speak today.
In any event, I think I might go and buy shares in purple ink companies, because I suspect there'll be quite a bit of purple crows coming back in response to some of this stuff, if what I've seen so far is any guide. Let's assume we find the non-CO2 process. Are we now in the first few steps of the process that we're now towards the end of with the CO2 emissions and the whole scheme? With the mandates and so forth, do you, in the ordinary course of events, would the non-CO2 process now move in the same way that the CO2 stuff did? Is that the expectation?
Well, I mean, I think non-CO2, the amount of attention and sort of learning and actually doing stuff that's happening now compared to the last 15 years is incredible. And I think humans are incredible. I mean, in terms of designing planes, flying them safely, and so on. It's great that attention is being paid to this because it matters. It's 1/2 to 2/3 of aviation's global warming impacts. But what it seems to me is there's value in potentially the routing of aircraft. This is what Google and American Airlines and Maastricht air traffic control area have been doing. And if you can really reduce warming contrails by 70% for a 0 or 0.1% fuel burn penalty, to me, it's obvious that the innovation.
17 or 770?
7-0. I mean,
7-0. Gosh.
What I understand from the scientists is the cost-benefit ratio is huge here, and so if an airline isn't willing to fly a better route because of a 0.1% fuel burn penalty, I mean, my view should be they should ask the Innovation Fund or the 1.6 billion at the next legislative revision to support better routing. This doesn't have to await Single Skies changes. I mean, this could happen from 2027, that airlines could fly better routes without worrying about the carbon fuel cost for them, if it's really benefiting the avoidance of non-CO2 impacts. The other angle I've seen is the fuel, that if you improve the fuel quality, either with more hydrotreatment or lowering the aromatics, then this can also reduce those impacts. So there's Innovation Fund money for doing all of this. And I have never seen this level of interest in the topic up until a year or so ago.
Interesting. Are you optimistic, Laurent, that your members will support the non-CO2 stuff as well?
I think it's very fair from what Damien said, that the debate on the non-CO2 is moving really fast. And in the next few years, things will move very, very fast as well. And which I think for our perspective is really good, because as soon as possible, we need to start talking about the mitigation measures.
Right.
So yeah, and by the way, it's very likely that the discussion over the mitigation measure will be much more difficult than discussing how do we monitor and report, because it will involve a different management of the airspace, a topic you know very well, because it will involve SAF, but SAF on which routes. So you know that there's plenty of room for discussion for the next few years.
Oh, but very good. Well, I'd hate to think we're all sitting around with nothing to talk about. You know, that would be terrible. The other issue in this, just apropos of nothing, of course, is this is going to have a very clear role for the ANSPs, because you'll be looking at changing flight plans dynamically. And so I hope that, and I know that at the Canso AGM this year, they had a scientist from NASA come and talk to them about it. But I think this is an area where we're clearly all going to have to work together. Very quickly, I don't know whether we're talking carrots or sticks here, but Lufthansa yesterday announced that it is going to put a surcharge, that's my word, not theirs, a surcharge on their flights to cover the cost of their compliance with emission and sustainability legislation more generally. we saw normally the standard position for airlines is if you increase the cost of a ticket by 1 cent, aviation will collapse, the world will probably end, and it's for sure certain that the cat won't get put out. But we've seen in the UK, the APD, which is a straight up and down charge on tickets, go up by incredible amounts, and yet growth continues in the UK. What do you think motivated Lufthansa, Laurent, to do it? And do you think they're taking a big risk? What happens if we hold a war and nobody comes? What happens if ticket sales continue on very nicely? Thank you.
So, I mean, there's a couple of elements. First, Air France, KLM did the same thing 2 years ago when France had its first SAF mandate in place. So it's been 2 years that you have a similar system of passing through cost. And by the way, even outside of SAF, it would not be the first time. You may remember Ryanair had its own.
Well, indeed, they did. It's made quite a lot of money out of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not unheard of. That's the first thing. The second thing is
if only that smart aleck didn't say what he said in the Financial Times this morning. Yeah.
The second thing is that we have to recognize that the decarbonization is going to cost a lot of money, and either we will pay for it as consumers or we'll pay for it as taxpayers. From a sector that is happy to be self-financed, I think it's fair to say that there's the consumer from our side who will end up paying the price. And we did our own analysis for what it's worth, and of course it's very difficult because every route is different, every price has different elasticity. But it's a common understanding that the ETS, for example, is going to add an extra 12 euros for your short haul or medium haul flight between now and 2030. A SAF mandate could add an extra 20 euros for your short haul flight by 2050, or even more so. So this is going to have a cost.
It'll have a cost, but will it have an impact?
Well, the cost of the decarbonization, or the price of the decarbonization, will have an impact on ticket prices. The margin.
Sorry, that wasn't my question. We're running out of time, but my question is, if I'm paying 10 euros for a ticket and I now have to pay a 20 euro tax so that I can fly somewhere and spend 500 euros on a hotel, I just wonder if we've got the proportions right.
Every flight is different, every seat is different. But
you should play cricket, Laurent. You've got a beautiful straight bat. Very beautiful straight bat. Damien, what's your thoughts on the Lufthansa thing?
I find it interesting because Deutsche Bahn, Eurostar, all of them have a ETS carbon cost, and they don't itemize it on the tickets.
They do or they don't?
They don't. When I look at my Brussels Airlines receipts, it itemizes how much CO2 there is from a flight. And so an intra-European flight, it's pretty easy to work out. It's around 6 euros today for an intra-European flight, the carbon price. And all of that money, is being used to tackle climate change. That's a legal commitment, which maybe sometimes is dismissed, but it's there in law. I would be interested to unpack more of what Lufthansa's changing, because costs are passed through to passengers in a competitive market where there's equal treatment on routes. So I don't think Lufthansa would be increasing ticket prices because of the ETS. The ETS has been there for over 10 years now. And the European Parliament and Council insisted on visibility for the 1.8 billion, 1.6 billion euros, for example. So I would hope that sort of not only costs are presented, but also benefits, because there are billions of euros going to alternative fuels and things like this. And we just recently had the sort of greenwashing complaints from 22 consumer organizations. So I couldn't see from the Lufthansa press release the details of how they're calculating this, but definitely for the emissions trading system, it only applies to flights within the European Economic Area, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. So it would be wrong to attribute any ETS costs to long-haul flights.
Right. Well, gentlemen, we have run out of time. I think we're sort of at a place where we've got a very carroty stick or a very sticky carrot, one or the other, in Europe. Thank you so much. I found that really illuminating. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you did as well. I'd like to thank Laurent and Damien one more time for giving us their time and explaining these really complicated issues.